Ahmed Twaij is an independent freelance journalist. His work has been published in numerous outlets, including The Independent, The Guardian, New York Times, Vice, BBC, and many more. His work has taken him across the US, UK, Europe, and the Middle East. After working as a doctor in London for a number of years, Ahmed began volunteering abroad, namely helping with the refugee crisis across Europe, where he developed his desire for storytelling. So welcome to the show, Ahmed.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
Of course. Thank you for joining all the way from London. And you're someone who I'm really looking forward to talking to. You've been on the show in the past, and it's always a really informative discussion. But part of the reason I'm so excited to talk to you is because as a doctor, you have an interesting, I'd say, perspective on a lot of what's happened recently, especially in terms of Israel's treatment of hospitals and targeting of hospitals. And also as someone who is whose family is from Iraq and someone who has been in Iraq, you know a little bit what the effects of ISIS has been. And so you're able to write this piece that you wrote, basically arguing that Hamas is not ISIS. And a little bit of behind the curtain stuff. I noticed that you wrote this piece at a venue that looks very cool. It's a place called the Markaz Review, but it described itself as a literature and arts publication. I noticed that you wrote this piece there, not at like NBC or at Al Jazeera, where you often write. So before we get into the piece, which is Gaza versus Mosul from a medical and humanitarian standpoint, can you tell us how you shop the piece around?
Firstly, like before I begin, I just want to say like it's difficult to really even talk about these issues in general because of how some of these atrocities that we're seeing, like it's just so horrific. Some of the things that we're witnessing every night. So as wonderful as it is to be here, I don't know if I could describe this as being wonderful to have to discuss. But in terms of this piece, to get it out there, I had to really like try shop it around. Like for me, I felt really passionate about this story because the number of times that this is being compared, Hamas is ISIS, and there's this whole horrible organization that we must wipe out a whole neighborhood for, a whole district for. And I felt passionate about trying to get it out, and I shopped it around the usual people I write for, from some of the well-known outlets, and a lot of them turned around and said no. And I think, to be honest with you, over the last couple of months, trying to publish anything about the issue in Palestine has come with a lot of rejection along the way. So it has been very difficult to talk about, and we've witnessed this a number of times. Mehdi Hassan's show, for example, just got shelved on NBC straight after his interview with Mark Regev. Other examples, you see the ones in Hollywood, for example. Actors and actresses are being shelved from films just because they spoke pro-Palestinian causes. If you call it a genocide, that's it, you're axed from a movie. And it's just happening so often. And me as a journalist trying to get work out that's happening the same thing. And thankfully, the Markaz Review, a great outlet who now, I've developed a great relationship with, were willing to take this piece on and, have an honest discussion about some of the issues I wanted to talk about.
As you mentioned, there's a lot of conflation, a lot of comparison between ISIS and Hamas. There's a hashtag, which is hashtag Hamas is ISIS. We also have a video clip that we're going to show. And this is, not surprisingly, Benjamin Netanyahu making the case that Hamas is ISIS. And here he is. This is shortly after October 7th. We'll see him. He's on stage with the lovely Antony Blinken.
President Biden was absolutely correct in calling this sheer evil. Hamas is ISIS. And just as ISIS was crushed, so too will Hamas be crushed. And Hamas should be treated exactly the way ISIS was treated. They should be spit out from the community of nations. No leader should meet them. No country should harbor them. And those that do should be sanctioned.
What is your response to that as someone who has spent time in Iraq?
I think there's a conceited effort by people like Netanyahu and within Israel, and even some American diplomats, to try to conflate the two, Hamas and ISIS. And it's quite clear what the reason is. One of the other things that Netanyahu says, for example, is he says Europe is going to be next, right? As if, us as Europeans, we should be worried that Hamas is going to be coming to our shores and attack us. And obviously that brings echoes of what ISIS did, the attacks in Paris, the attacks in London, etc., etc. So people start getting that worry. And with those attacks that happened, for example, when the refugee crisis happened, people were willing to call them, you know, a swarm of refugees and therefore dehumanize these refugees and no longer want to give aid, etc. So once you dehumanize this group as being something so vicious as ISIS, who were so barbaric that they were willing to kill anyone and anything that disagreed with them, you've dehumanized an entire population. So you've dehumanized the Palestinians. You make it actually palatable for a Western audience to be like, actually, if they're like ISIS, then we should be destroying them. We should be destroying anyone affiliated with them. And it makes it acceptable for us to see those bombs dropping in Gaza, where in reality, what the differences between the two are quite significant. Hamas has this ideology of it was rooted in Palestinian nationalism as a resistance movement. Yes, it's an Islamist resistance movement, but it's a resistance movement, and very nationalistic. It doesn't cross the border. It doesn't go into international territories. Doesn't even go to neighboring countries like Lebanon. ISIS was a transnational takfirism ideology, and by that I mean the concept of takfirism is where they believe anyone who doesn't believe in what they believe is a kafir, which translates to mean infidel. And anyone who's a kafir, therefore, is paramount to be killed, or someone who's going to be killed. Hamas isn't like that. In reality, Christians live in Gaza. They have churches, they go to church, they celebrate Christmas, etc., openly. ISIS, if you remember, when they first came out, they would put the letter N, which stands for Nasri in Arabic, which means Christian, on the doors of Christian homes to highlight who to target as Christians. The difference between ISIS and Hamas is quite widespread. Like if I was to go into ISIS territory, I would become a target.
Huh.
If you were to go into ISIS territory, you would become a target. Whereas there are, you know, Western white people in Gaza, for example, trying to give aid, trying to give supplies, and journalists out there, none of them are being attacked or targeted. Whereas and you know, this isn't for me to say, you know, nothing Hamas has done is criminal. I'm just pointing out the differences between ISIS and Hamas. ISIS did use a hospital as a command center in Iraq, in Mosul. They did use a church as a command center. In fact, in one church, because you know how churches are quite long in their design, because of its length, they used it as a target range.
Oh, right.
For training. And we've got a picture of that church.
Yeah.
And
So
what's ironic
disgusting that they would
is
use
that
that for target practice. Ugh.
they used that for target practice. They didn't burn it until they were retreating. So their last thing was to try to set it alight and then retreat. The Pope actually visited that when he visited Iraq last year. Anyway, my point is that when you compare,
how would they deal with that? So if ISIS is in the church or ISIS is in the hospital, what would they do?
they would go in so the church was liberated by ground. As you can see, there is no airstrike. The structure is still standing.
Yeah.
It's standing. Compare that to Gaza, where there's a 12th century church there that was attacked in an airstrike, where it was being used as a place of refuge, killing both Christians and Muslims who were there to try to seek protection. And it's this when you sit there comparing these two organizations together, really what I'm thinking in my head is the comparison is that Israel is more comparable to ISIS in this situation. They've forced Gaza's Christian population to be at risk. Just like ISIS caused Mosul's Christian population to be at risk, it's been Israel this time, not Hamas. So that comparison is quite an obscure comparison for me to even understand. And it's quite bizarre for them to try to make this conflation, but it's understandable because somebody in the West who won't understand what Hamas is, maybe has never even heard of Hamas, but they've heard of ISIS because it was all over the news. Once you put those two together, why not bomb the hell out of those people? Right?
Especially if you combine that with the narrative that these people elected. You know, we have a lot of people blaming the people of Gaza for electing Hamas. Obviously, you and I and most people watching the show know that that's a ridiculous argument to make, especially when half of the population is children. But by their logic, if Hamas is this unadulterated evil, as Joe Biden said, or if it's like ISIS, as Netanyahu is saying, then as you've been saying, Ahmed, it's a lot more palatable to kill civilians because these are civilians who voted in, according to this narrative, who voted in evil.
I mean that whole argument is just ludicrous because you could
Of
turn it
course.
around and say, you know, Israelis voted in Netanyahu, therefore any crime that Netanyahu does, every Israeli is to be held to account.
Right. It's a
Actually,
ridiculous argument. I'm just saying it is used, that we've seen this used. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And if
Which
anything,
makes it a dangerous combination. Yeah. Keep
to
going.
be
Sorry.
honest, it's quite Islamophobic. Like I find it fascinating that there was this article, and I mentioned it to you earlier, by Howard Jacobson in the Guardian, in the Observer, which is the bigger version of the Guardian on Sundays, where he tried to say anybody who calls what Israelis are doing as genocide or anything like that is purely anti-Semitic because they're comparing them to Nazis. And actually, what I'm saying is what Israelis have done is the complete opposite. They've compared everything that any Arab does to ISIS, and that's not the reality. So just like he's suggesting it's anti-Semitic, this is purely Islamophobic.
It reminds me of also the way that it was so easy for America to link Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, also because of ignorance about the Muslim world and the Arab world, right? Because if anyone knew anything about bin Laden and Hussein, they'd know that these were people who are actually at odds ideologically. One is fundamentalist and one is secular. There are lots of differences. That's just one difference.
Yeah, there's actually a fascinating book called Debriefing the President by something Nixon. I forget his first name right now, but he was the CIA agent who debriefed Saddam. So he spent 6 months with Saddam before Saddam was put to trial, and he said what Saddam's sentiment was he couldn't understand why he wasn't seen by the Americans as the #1 ally against terrorists and Islamists, because he himself was an anti-Islamist. So
Right.
he couldn't understand that relation. So yeah, it does have those echoes. I remember Donald Rumsfeld wrote within 2 hours of 9/11 happening, he wrote on a note of paper, and that note exists. You can see it, like copies of it. He wrote, "Find a way to link this to Saddam." And if you're telling me that Netanyahu hadn't waited for something like this to happen for him to completely wipe out Israel, it's ludicrous. There have been plans that have been declassified where we can see multiple times Netanyahu and his party were planning on some sort of destruction in Gaza. And actually, there's this phrase in Hebrew. I don't know the Hebrew phrase, but the translation is it's called mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
And other phrases are called, they call it the Dahiya doctrine, where they did the same thing in Lebanon, where they completely destroy a city every now and then to make the people hate their government or the people that are occupying them, and just to keep them under wraps. And actually what's happened is the more we see this death and destruction, it's the more Israel is losing, the more people are growing hate towards Israel as a nation. And I'm not talking about just Gaza itself. This is like a global thing, right? People are turning around and seeing what's happening in Gaza and feeling that innocent kids just shouldn't be dying. Those like faces of babies, things like that, just should not be happening.